Today we have Professor Tracy McKenzie, who's coming back after talking to us about American civil religion in the Revolutionary era, focusing especially on religion and the Constitution. Today he's going to carry the same discussion forward into the Civil War era, addressing today the Gettysburg Address, and next week, the second inaugural address. To lead off, I'm going to show you a picture of the handout that he's giving to the audience. And is that about right?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's
Okay.
keep it there for a while so people can read it if they want.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Turn it around, or?
There's a picture on the back.
Yeah. There's a picture.
Yeah, in Oregon, I don't know.
Okay.
You've got one? Oh, everybody's got one already. I wasn't calling. All right.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to be with you again. I was here, as John said, it's about a year and a half ago. It was the fall of 2024. And I really enjoyed the opportunity to be with you, and glad to be back. So you tell me, is this loud enough?
Yes.
You're able to hear okay? Once I get started, I tend to raise my voice, I get excited, and then if it starts hurting your ears, let me know. John said something about the topic. Let me just share a little bit more about that before we get started. First of all, it begins with my own sense of vocation. Vocation is a little bit of a mysterious thing to me. I don't like to be dogmatic about it, but I still have a kind of sense of God's calling, and in particular the ways that I particularly believe that my own passions intersect with the needs of our culture. And I define my own vocation as remembering and reminding. I remember the past, and I particularly have a passion for reminding the church. Because I really believe that historical perspective matters, not just in an academic way. I think it matters to our desire to live wisely, to live faithfully. I think historical perspective allows us to see our world more clearly than we would otherwise. There's one historian I really appreciated, a woman named Margaret Bendroth, and she says that Americans are largely stranded in the present. And I love that word picture. Now, you can imagine sort of being a castaway on a desert island, cut off from all the rest of the human race. And in a sense, when we live without historical perspective, we're not cutting ourselves off from all of the human race. We're just cutting ourselves off from about 94% of all the people who have ever lived. And so I don't think that's wise. And so that's my own sense of calling. I do believe that the church can be blessed with historical perspective. So you have a handout. Let me just say a word about it really quickly. There's two addresses there. John is right. I'm going to focus on the Gettysburg Address today. I may or may not work in a little reference to Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural, but I did cut out one particular passage that I think is really revealing of how Lincoln was thinking at that moment. And then we'll spend most of our time thinking about the Gettysburg Address. If you have flipped over, and if you haven't, you might want to do that, you can see this is the only known surviving photograph of the ceremony in November of 1863 where Lincoln spoke at the dedication of the National Military Cemetery about 4 months after the Battle of Gettysburg on the site of the battle itself. I was joking with someone a moment ago that you get extra credit if you can figure out which is Lincoln. One of the things I'll just call attention to, the sort of the speakers and the party of dignitaries are in fact sitting on a platform. But the platform is only a few feet above ground level, so you're actually not going to see them very, very well. The other thing that immediately will strike you, think about just the crush of human beings right up against the platform. Can you imagine today a situation where the President of the United States could be surrounded by civilians in that kind of proximity? So let me just tell you what historians believe is Lincoln. If you look at pretty much the center of the photograph, and I know the quality is not great, but the quality originally was not. It was blurred. But if you look at the figure pretty much right in the center, there is an individual who's clearly standing, who's wearing a top hat, and looks to have maybe something like a sash across his chest. Well, that's not Lincoln, all right? But let that be a reference point. So to our left, if you look almost immediately to that one fellow who's standing with the top hat, you'll see someone who is seated, who is bareheaded, and who appears to be looking sort of down into his lap. Anybody following where I'm suggesting? So that, historians believe, is Abraham Lincoln. All right. If you flip back over the picture that is next to the Gettysburg Address, the text, that is a picture that Lincoln had made about a week before he traveled to Gettysburg. So that is really very contemporary to the address itself. The picture that I put at the top of the page is actually a picture that Lincoln made not too long before his first inaugural. So these are both pretty close to when he was speaking, and I'll have another picture for you next Sunday where we'll see Lincoln just about 6 weeks before his death when we look at the second inaugural. So let me just tell you why I think the Gettysburg Address is important. We're going to talk about it this morning as a classic expression of what scholars call American civil religion. And John referred to that concept just a moment ago. I just wonder, this is not a quiz, but how many of you have come across that concept or that term? Anyone? So I see a couple, maybe 3 folks. Well, let me talk with you about it just a little bit. The term actually probably, or the concept, dates back at least to the 18th century, but in terms of American context, it's a concept that really was begun to be developed last few decades of the 20th century. There was a scholar at the University of California who was there for several decades, a man named Robert Bellah. And Bellah began to think about this concept. He was a sociologist at Berkeley. He was a sociologist of religion, and he focused on world religion. And one of the things that he did was just to look at patterns across time and space. And he concluded that pretty much universally, he believed that nations had some form of what he called a collective religious self-understanding. He said that pretty much every people, every nation had some sense in which they were able to situate their nation, their people, into some context relative to the divine, however they understood that. So he basically said this is what he called civil religion. I think that's a little abstract, and so let me just tell you how I'm going to approach it myself this morning and also in the project that I'm involved in. I think of it as a story that we tell ourselves. In different ways, in different contexts, it's a story that we collectively tell ourselves about the relation between the United States and God. Whatever that looks like, whatever that means. Very broad definition that I'm using here. It's a story we tell ourselves about the religious meaning of the nation, whatever that is. I want to emphasize that I like to think of it as a story. And the reason why, there's multiple reasons why, but it starts with the idea that I really think human beings are storytelling creatures. We all are sort of perpetually telling ourselves our story. That's the way we sort of situate who we are. One historian that I like puts it this way. She says, we live our lives, we tell our stories, it is as natural as breathing, which means we're not very self-conscious about it. We're doing it constantly, even if we're not self-conscious about it. Does anybody recognize the name Neil Postman? Wrote a book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, among other things. He's deceased now for some time. But Postman said that human beings require stories to give meaning to our lives. They help us to understand why we are here. They give us an answer to the question, who am But if individuals need stories, nations need stories as well. There's just no doubt about that. So nations tell stories to answer the question, who are we? I'm not really talking necessarily about a kind of official story that's sort of given from on high. I'm talking about something that's more decentralized from the bottom up. But nations develop stories that answer the question, who are we? Now, there's not going to be one story. There may be multiple stories circulating, sometimes contradictory stories circulating simultaneously. But the most powerful stories, I'm convinced, are the stories that give us a kind of moral identity. And when enough of us sort of buy into the same story, we can think of our nation as having a civil religion. All right? Civil religion always addresses two questions. It says, what are the values that we believe are so important that we're willing to sacrifice for them, to defend them, maybe even to die for them? Are there such values that we believe oblige us, that constrain us? So that's the first question. Second question is, why do those values have any moral authority over our lives? In other words, not just do we like them, but is there some sense that they rightfully can demand something of us? So another way to put it, the stories tend to say, what do we believe in, and where do those values come from? Which means sort of inevitably, whether it's explicit or implicit, our civil religion always says not only something about what we think defines us as a people, but it says something about what we think is our relationship with God or gods, however we answer that question. What is the moral authority of the values that we hold? So that's what we're talking about. Let me just make 4 generalizations really quickly. Then we're going to turn to Abraham Lincoln, all right? Civil religion has 4 attributes that I think we want to know about. It is inevitable. So what I mean by that is not a really good use of our time to debate whether we should have a civil religion or not. The question is, how might we think about it wisely? How might we think about it from our perspective of faith convictions and not be molded by something that is in fact perhaps contradictory or incompatible with our faith? But it's inevitable. Secondly, it's organic. And what I mean by that is it's living. The story that nations tell themselves is ongoing, it evolves, it changes over time. It's a moving target, in a sense. It's not finished once and for all and then sort of bequeathed to each generation. It's constantly being reinvented and re-understood. So it's inevitable, it's organic, it is ubiquitous. And what I mean by that is it's being shaped in all manner of ways around us all the time. Oftentimes we think of particular spaces that we almost think of as sacred. Battlefields. One of the great places today in the American imagination is Gettysburg. It's a place that we've sort of infused with a kind of religious significance. If you're running for president, you go to Gettysburg to give a speech. If you have some sort of social protest that you want to mount, you go to Gettysburg to have that kind of demonstration. We think somehow it is connected to who we are as a people in a really profound way. So we think about places. Ground Zero, New York City, would be such a place. Some of you may remember something about the USS Arizona, the battleship that was sunk at Pearl Harbor. There's a memorial there. And we think of it as having a profound significance for the nation. So there are places like that, cemeteries. Arlington National Cemetery would be another one. But it's much more than that. I want to suggest that our civil religion is being shaped in classrooms. It's being shaped in convention halls. It's being shaped almost constantly online by any number of blogs and podcasts and memes and tweets of all things. It's also shaped in the sort of documents that we think are somehow really special. So you might think of what are our sacred, I'll put sacred in quotation marks, but what are our sacred texts? Declaration of Independence? Sure. Bill of Rights, probably. I'm talking about statements that seem to capture things that we believe in, the values that we want to defend. Move more recently, maybe Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. But surely, I want to believe, I believe this is true, the two most sacred documents of American civil religion are the Gettysburg Address and Lincoln's second inaugural address. If you go to the Lincoln Memorial today, I don't know, how many of you have been to the Lincoln Memorial? Just have a sense of that? You may remember, you walk up those at something like 50 some odd steps. You have the 20-foot high statue of Lincoln. If you look to your left, so over here, if you look to your left, it's Gettysburg Address. If you look to your right on the wall, it's the second inaugural address. The message, the unstated message of that memorial from the 1920s is that these two speeches are complementary. They're sort of compatible, two halves of a single whole in a sense. And I want to suggest that that's absolutely wrong. I want to suggest that these two documents really should be read in tension with each other, in some senses contradictory to one another. And if I can sort of put out a teaser there, you tell all your friends, and sort of just pack this room next time, I'm gonna interpret the second inaugural as Abraham Lincoln's correction of the Gettysburg Address. That he actually comes to rethink some of the things that he says at Gettysburg, and is offering a very, 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 very different story in the second inaugural. All right, so let's turn to Gettysburg Address. Whoops, question from the audience already.
No, I Googled what's the most important presidential address.
Okay.
I did it more than once, and it always comes out Gettysburg.
That doesn't.
I don't think
That
that
doesn't
shocks you, but I just
surprise
want
me.
you to know that even a...
No, I appreciate that. I thought you were going to say no one remembered the Gettysburg Address. I was going to be in trouble right off the bat there. No, it doesn't surprise me. I think I have quotes here that I'm not going to take time to share, but if you Google it, you'll see that over the years, maybe not quite as much now, but over the years, we've been just unstinting in our praise of the Gettysburg Address. And even as late as 2013, which was the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Association had this massive sort of year-long sort of celebration and remembrance of the Gettysburg Address. And they invited individuals to write in their understanding of the address, why it's important, what they sort of impute to it. And responses came in from all around the world. And it's clear that at least as late as 2013, most Americans said if there's one document that we believe captures who we want to be, who we aspire to be, it's the Gettysburg Address. So let's think about that address. A word really quickly about its author. One of the questions that we want to ask typically, particularly if we're thinking about American civil religion, we want to ask the question, well, what did Lincoln himself believe? In other words, what were his religious beliefs to the degree that we can figure out what they were? And I would just want to emphasize my own real hesitation to address that question dogmatically. I've read, to my knowledge, everything that has survived that Abraham Lincoln wrote. His personal papers run to 8 volumes, about 4,000 pages. He does not talk explicitly about his personal religious convictions. And that in itself can be a kind of clue. You might say, oh, well, that's very significant that he doesn't. But still, we don't know for sure how to read that silence. Was it because he thought that was nobody's business but his own? And he didn't keep a diary. We're talking about things that he's writing that he knows are always going to be read, at least by one other person, but often by large audiences. So maybe he just doesn't think that's something he should talk about in public. Or maybe it just never occurs to him as being important. It's really hard for us to say. So most of the evidence that we have about Lincoln's faith has 2 attributes. It's secondhand, and it comes after his death. Because the question of Lincoln's faith was only sporadically of interest during his lifetime to other people. Now, certainly by the time he's president of the United States, a lot of prominent American Christians would like to claim him as, a member of their tradition. But it really becomes important after he dies. Because after he dies, I think you will readily imagine this, he becomes almost immediately one of the most revered figures in all of American history. And the very timing of his death has a major impact on that. I mean, you may know this, that Robert E. Lee is going to surrender to Ulysses Grant on Palm Sunday in 1865. Sort of the same time, the anniversary of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem of Jesus. And then when is Lincoln assassinated? On Good Friday. Right? And that symbolism was so powerful at the time. So within 2 days of his death, so on Easter Sunday, all across the North, not so much in the South, but all across the North, pastors are sort of thinking of Lincoln as a messianic figure, as a Christ-like figure. As Christ died to make men holy, Abraham Lincoln has died to make men free, or died to preserve the Union, or however you complete that story. All of this is to say, the evidence that we have is secondhand, and it is a time when already there was a battle taking place for Lincoln's soul. That is to say, to prove that he was a believer, or actually there were some American skeptics who were very determined to prove that he was not. And so it's really hard to sift through that. And so I'm not going to be very dogmatic at all, but let me just make some broad generalizations. Almost everyone who has studied Lincoln closely, his faith closely, would say a few things that they would agree on. One, he's born into a really devout Christian family. His father and his stepmother, his mother dies when he's 7, his father remarries when he's 9. His father and stepmother, by all accounts, were very devout, staunchly Calvinist in terms of their particular Christian theology. So Lincoln was raised in that environment. What he thought of it, it's hard for us to say. It's really hard for us to say. We know that his relationship with his father was very rocky. He's not at all close to his father. Probably, you could almost say, estranged from his father for most of his adult life. So he's born into that environment. By the time he's a young adult, though, almost all of the people who talk about him, who knew him, either in New Salem, which was the little village that he moved to once he left home, or in Springfield, where he would spend almost 2 decades of his life, the people who met him almost never described him as devout, and often would have said he was pretty ostentatiously skeptical, sort of openly critical of the inspiration of Scripture, openly critical of much of what we would consider foundational beliefs of traditional historical Orthodox Christianity, at least for a period of time. It's into his 30s, maybe almost approaching 40, that he begins to attend church pretty regularly. We know that his wife, Mary, is a member of a congregation in Springfield, and he does attend with her often, but he never joins the church. He's never baptized. He never makes what we would call any kind of public profession of faith. He never, in any way that we could verify, identified himself as a Christian. Having said all that, there's no doubt that he believes in a God. He's not an atheist. He's moved away from that total skepticism. By the time that he's president of the United States, it's pretty clear that he believes that there is a God over the universe, and even that this God acts in some way. Not a deistic God that sort of stays off to the side, but acts, intervenes, helps to shape human history. I think the best religious biography of Lincoln sort of arrives at that conclusion, that Lincoln believes in a sovereign God, never showed evidence of believing in a personal, saving God. He doesn't refer to Jesus, ever. He refers to the Savior one time in those 4,000 pages of his personal papers. So that's, I think, about as far as we can go. And yet, his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, who herself tells a reporter after the Civil War, her husband, she says, was not a technical Christian, whatever she meant by that. It would be great to have her define that more. But she said he was very religious. She says he does not have faith in the, quote, normal acceptation of that term. And I think what she means is most people who were widely understood as Christians would not have viewed him as a Christian, and yet profoundly religious. And what I think she meant by that was that he was perpetually asking religious questions and was deeply wrestling with those questions. Maybe more than we can tell than any other man who's ever held the office of President of the United States. And so let's talk about that a little bit in the context of the Gettysburg Address. So, first thing we have to say about the Gettysburg Address is we have to understand it functions on multiple levels. It is a political speech on one level. And that can almost sound sacrilegious to say that it was given by a politician for political purposes, but it was on one level. It's a war speech. We're more than 2 years into a war that most Americans thought would be over in a matter of weeks. It's been more costly than anyone had dreamed in terms of blood and treasure. It is generating or stimulating the largest anti-war movement in American history. We never remember that the greatest anti-war movement was in the North during the Civil War. Lincoln wants to do something to stimulate support for the war. So we start there. It's a war speech. That doesn't denigrate it, just it sort of acknowledges the obvious. It's a moral exhortation as well. I mean, if you look at it closely, he is exhorting his audience in a particular moral way. I think one of the things he's doing above all is he's challenging them to expand how they define and understand human equality. He's taking them back to the Declaration of Independence, but he's challenging them to remember and understand it differently than most Americans had since 1776. He's stressing the need for genuine equality. He's challenging Americans to preserve a fragile democracy. And when I think about that, I think it's as timely as ever. Don't we need voices to challenge us to rethink what justice means, what equality means? Don't we need, as a culture, to be challenged to realize that democracy is fragile? There's nothing inevitable about its survival. It's very timely. But the Gettysburg Address is not just a political speech in wartime. It's not just a moral exhortation. It is both of those things in the form of a story. And that's how I want us to think about it. It's a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. It begins by reference to the founding of the nation. That's the past. It links the founding of the nation to the present war. It says this is how you must understand the meaning of the war. We're going to link it to what we believe as a people, what defines us as citizens of the country. And then it looks to the future, and he tells his audience there is unfinished work that needs to be completed. And when we do that successfully, it will result in certain things. We can expect certain transformations to occur. So I think that's the way, honestly, to think about it. So let's start there. It's a story. So what kind of story is it? Short? We'll start there. How about that? 272 words. Maybe you've heard that before. The invocation that opened the ceremony, the commemoration, the dedication of the battlefield ceremony, the invocation was 5 times longer than the Gettysburg Address. The estimate is, we have the complete text. It would have taken about 10 minutes to deliver. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address probably took somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes to deliver. And that's even when his own philosophy as a public speaker was speak slowly. All right, so it's very, very short. It's a short story to begin with. It is a simple story. Almost all of the words are words of one syllable. The sentences tend to be a little bit longer. I could fault him on that, but the words are short, typically. The structure is very straightforward. But the question that we want to ask is, does it have a religious message? Does it have a religious message? Well, you can think, answer that question to yourself about that. Let me just share what both historians and popular writers have struggled with for the last century and a half. There are 2 words in the Gettysburg Address that we might say are explicitly religious. Under God. That's right. Extra credit for whoever said that first. Under God. So here's a little bit of context. We do have, best historians can tell, the actual manuscript paper, the draft of Lincoln's address. Now, it was later recopied. He copied it himself at least twice for individuals who asked for copies to be used for charitable purposes, like fundraising for veterans and that sort of thing. But in his draft, in other words, what I think was in his breast pocket as he arrived at the cemetery and mounted the platform to speak, in that draft, there is no reference to God. And yet there are at least, I think, 4 to 5 reporters representing major newspapers who had been trained in shorthand, who were trying to take down the text as quickly as Lincoln spoke, and they all agreed that he said, "Under God." When Lincoln copied the address afterwards for these charitable purposes, he also said, "Under God." So there's pretty good evidence, I think pretty compelling evidence, that the draft that he wrote out did not include it, and that spontaneously, as he was speaking, he added it. Now, as a historian, that's a real mystery. What do you do with that? What do you do with that? On the one hand, we could say, yes, the religious dimension was so important to Abraham Lincoln that he even forgot it at all as he was working on the address. And then as he stood up, maybe he saw a minister out in the audience, he thought to himself, my gosh, I got to work this in somehow, right? Or, another way to read that is, it was so important to him that he had to intentionally add it at a certain moment. So it's significant.
Or a simple political statement.
Or it could have, well, of course, when we say it was significant, it could be significant because of his personal conviction. It could be significant because of what he thought was the utility of it. Right? Bottom line is, what do we do with that? Well, here's what I want to suggest is a way to approach it. I want to suggest that we set that aside for the moment, all right, knowing that it's a thorny issue. And let's just look at the other 270 words, all right, out of the 272. And ask ourselves, does this make a religious argument or give a religious message? In other words, what he actually had written out, carried with him, does it have a religious message? Here the problem then is, there's no reference to God if we set aside under God. There are no explicit allusions to Scripture. And so historians who are looking for this often end up sort of grasping for word choice that has some sort of echo of Scripture. Does that make sense to you, what I'm saying? So you'll read studies that say, oh, the Gettysburg Address has biblical cadences, or the Gettysburg Address has biblical rhythms, right? And I'm totally willing to concede that, except I just don't know what it meant. One of the things we do know is that the Bible was common in Lincoln's household growing up. We know that Lincoln read the Bible because he does allude to it in other contexts quite often. We also know the Bible is the most commonly read book in America at the time. And so if Lincoln is using language that comes from Scripture, that wouldn't have been so very unusual, and might not have proved anything one way or the other. Lincoln often did use biblical language. You may know his phrase, a house divided against itself cannot stand. Maybe you've come across that somewhere. You know, I'm sure, where that comes from, right? It comes from the New Testament. It comes from Jesus. The Pharisees are telling to Jesus, who's cast out demons, they're saying, but you cast out demons by the power of Beelzebub. And Jesus said, well, wait a minute, that's sort of illogical, isn't it? If I cast out demons by the sort of the prince of demons, then Satan is divided among himself. When Lincoln is saying there's a house divided against itself, he means that the United States cannot continue indefinitely as a half-slave, half-free society. He's really not saying anything about demonic possession at that moment. It's just a figure of speech that lots of people would have understood. Do you know the name Stephen Douglas? Stephen Douglas was another Illinoisan. He was Abraham Lincoln's chief rival in the 1850s and then in the presidential race of 1860. There's a moment in the 1850s where a lot of Northern Democrats are really sort of put out with Stephen Douglas. He hasn't really held the party line the way they think that he should have. And Lincoln loves watching that from the distance. And he writes to one of his correspondents, he says that Stephen Douglas came back to Illinois, came to his own, and his own received him not. Do you recognize that? What is that a reference to? It's the Gospel of John talking about Jesus Christ. And let me tell you, Lincoln was not comparing Stephen Douglas to Jesus Christ. So he uses biblical language and biblical metaphors, and his audience immediately sort of get it. But not literally. They know it's not meant to be a literal biblical argument, because it would be nonsensical if that were the case. Right? So we just have to be very, very careful. But there are words here, there are phrases that do probably trigger in our minds some kind of remembrance of at least the King James Version of Scripture. Now, I tried to highlight some of those for you. If I had thought we had time, I would have just made it open-ended and say, look over this really fast, tell me words that strike you as sort of biblical sounding. But do you see some of them there? Our fathers. Some scholars have suggested that there's a little bit of an echo of the Lord's Prayer. Brought forth appears many times in Scripture, but we would probably associate it most commonly with the Virgin Mary and birth of Christ, right? Conceived, that's not uniquely biblical, but it is it's a word that was used more commonly in Scripture than I think in the vernacular at that time. You see farther on down there, consecrate, hallow, new birth. There are a bunch of phrases like that. So what do we do with that? What do we do with the fact that there are some words here? Well, one way is to say this is clearly biblical. This is theologically rich. This is evidence of Lincoln's deep faith. And I think all those things are probably not justifiable conclusions, to be honest. I think we ask the wrong question when we're looking for the religious message of the Gettysburg Address. We ask the wrong question when we say, where does the language come from? One historian has said, of those 272 words, 269 of them can be found in the Bible. Starting with that, which appears 13 times. We appears 10 times. The appears 11 times. I'm not sure any of that proves anything, right? I think it's the wrong question to ask, at least at the beginning. Now, I think Lincoln's use of biblical-sounding language was not irrelevant. I think it matters. But I don't think we start there. I think the question you have to ask is, if this is a story, what is this story about? Who is its central character? Do you have any sense about that? Who is this story about? Well, I want to tell you that the Gettysburg Address is about the nation. Maybe that's so obvious that it doesn't, we even sort of miss that. But it is about the nation. Think about it as a play, like a theatrical performance that you might attend. The opening scene has the founders, what he calls the fathers. But they're only on stage long enough to sort of announce what the defining commitments, the defining values of the country are. Then we would think of this as an immediate shift of scene, right? The second scene is set when? 1863. Now the main figures on stage are those soldiers who here gave their lives, these honored dead, right? Why are they giving their lives? They're giving their lives that the nation might live. Finally, he turns, you can almost imagine turning to the audience and say, but now you must pick up the baton. Now you must finish the work that has begun. Why? Because that will guarantee the survival of the nation and the transformation of the nation, he says, with a new birth of freedom. But you see that what holds together the Gettysburg Address is the nation. It is about the nation. And it is a story about the nation that, at least in his draft, Lincoln did not link with God in any way. One of the things that I think is helpful here as we think about this is to compare the Gettysburg Address with what Northern clergy are saying at the same time. When we read the Gettysburg Address against those sermons, its fundamentally secular nature just leaps out at us. One of the things I'm doing in my project right now is I've looked at about 200 published sermons from Northern ministers during the war. So in a time, very different technological environment, this was usually pretty large churches, very typically educated and well-resourced churches that would publish the sermons of some of the sermons of their ministers. And so when you read those sermons, God is the central character of their sermons about the war. They're telling their congregations, they're telling their readers that God is sovereign over every detail of the war they're raging. In some sense, this is something that God has ordained. He's working it out according to the counsel of His will. He is doing His work, whatever that is, for the nation, for American people, black and white. God is the central character. They are often saying that God is judging the nation, that the war itself is a judgment, really on North and South, particularly usually for the presence of slavery is what they're mentioning. Not always. You would think that slavery always is at the top of the list, but let me just share with you really quickly. In these sermons, ministers are saying God is judging us, and they're judging us for, this is a sampling. Violation of the Sabbath, covetousness, grinding of the poor, adultery, ingratitude, depraved journalists, licentiousness, pride, luxurious extravagance, profane swearing, arrogance, lewdness, gambling, corruption of manners, disrespect of parents, neglect of the Bible, neglect of prayer, and a constitution that never mentions God. These are all mentioned by ministers as what surely is what has triggered God's displeasure with the land. What Lincoln does not do in the Gettysburg Address is to say that God is judging the nation. What Lincoln does not do in the Gettysburg Address is say that in some sense I know what God is doing. But Lincoln does suggest that the nation has a unique role in world affairs. And he describes the dead at Gettysburg in a way that is profoundly religious. So let me just call your attention to a couple of things here, then I'm going to stop and see if you have some thoughts or questions or reactions. So there are two ways that Lincoln is going to exalt the nation in a very, very dramatic way. First is by giving them a special mission to the world. So let me show you where I think that is illustrated. So there's twice in the text here that I have underlined as opposed to bolded some. So look at that second paragraph of the address. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, referring to the United States, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. Do you see the significance of or any nation? Lincoln is not just at Gettysburg. I'm contextualizing in my own mind a lot of things that he has said before this. Lincoln is saying that this is a struggle. This is a contest not for the survival of the United States, per se. It is a struggle for the survival or the potential for democracy in the world, both now, and he will say at other times, for all ages to come. It is a world existential crisis, and if the United States is not triumphant, democracy has no hope in the world to come. Look then at the bottom. This is perhaps the most widely remembered part of the Gettysburg Address. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Do you see the word that was in his original draft that he struck out? Do you see the difference that it makes to strike that word out? He's saying, nope, I don't just mean this government. I mean any government grounded in consent, any government that aspires to government of the people. He will actually say, 11 months before the Gettysburg Address, in his second annual message in December 1862, he says the United States is the last best hope of earth. And I just wonder as Christians if we can listen to that and take it literally, because I guarantee you that Lincoln chose his words very carefully. He is not saying that the church is the hope of the earth. He's not saying that the gospel message is in some way the hope of the earth. He's saying that the United States is the hope, the last hope, not just the best hope, the last hope of earth. If the United States is not triumphant, all hope for all the world, for all time, vanishes. Right? It's a pretty high opinion he has of the United States. In a sense, the United States will be the Messiah of nations. Finally, just really quickly, how does he speak about the dead? And I just underscored 3 words in that last paragraph that he uses, or last 2 paragraphs. Consecrate. We cannot, meaning the audience, we cannot consecrate this ground. It has already been consecrated. What does it mean to consecrate?
Make it sacred.
To set aside as holy. Right? In both the Anglican and Episcopalian and Catholic traditions, there are actually liturgies for the consecration of cemetery. And they vary, I guess, a little bit, but basically the priest walks around the boundaries of the land that's going to be dedicated, sprinkling holy water, and praying that God would receive all who would be interred there. Right? In a certain sense, I don't think Lincoln was conscious of this at all, but I'm just struck by the reverse symmetry. At Gettysburg in the dedication here, it's not priests with holy water who will dedicate the grounds, consecrate the ground, with soldiers with their blood. Do you see how this changes things dramatically? The redeemers, the blood that is shed, the blood that transforms, is the blood of the soldiers. And what is being redeemed? It's not the church, it's the nation. Do you see the significance of that difference? He's also going to talk about devotion, which is an ambiguous word. You can be devoted to anything. You can be devoted to a hobby. You can be devoted to your family. You can be devoted to Chicago Bears. But it also has connotations of religious devotion. We talk about someone living a life of devotion. We talk about having our personal daily devotion. In the 19th century, I guarantee you that meaning of the word was more common. So he's actually saying that what these soldiers have done is an act of worship, in essence. And then finally, new birth. Their death will bring to the United States a new birth, which was probably the most powerful metaphor for regeneration of the early church. It was symbolic of dying with Christ and being raised again to new life. Lincoln is associating it with soldiers who died for the nation. So here's the hard thing, and I don't know if this bothers you to hear this or not. I think the Gettysburg Address is the most powerful expression of who the nation would like to be in terms of a commitment to democracy, all that might connote. I also think it is a borderline idolatrous statement that actually contributes to a way of thinking that equates the nation with the church. And so as a Christian, I would sort of challenge you at least to think that it's a speech that we have to treat with discernment. There are going to be elements of it that we can endorse and elements of it that we should say are dangerous. So on that very, very happy note, I'm going to stop, but I will say, remember, next time, I'm going to tell you, I think the second inaugural address is the greatest address by any public American figure ever. But that's partly because I also think it's a contradiction and even a repudiation of the Gettysburg Address. Do we have maybe 6 or 7 minutes for questions or responses? Yes, ma'am.
I was thinking that this really feeds into the idea that the United States is the promised land for the world, really, and that it ties into later expressions of that idea that Israel then becomes the new promised land as well in a similar way, which it gets into what you just said.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. In Lincoln's mind, I don't think he would not use language of the United States as the promised land. And in fact, he doesn't use the word mission. one of the wonderful things about being a historian today is, all of Lincoln's correspondence is digitized. I just do word searches. And he never uses the term mission in a religious sense. To have mission meant that someone had sent you on mission. So he's not going to use that language. But he does use the language of a unique, historically unique role of the United States in the world. Just to complicate things even just a little bit more, scholars of nationalism will say that you can be committed to a nation in a kind of transactional way. And what they mean by that is there are values that you think supersede any government or any nation, but you believe that your nation supports those values. And to the degree that it does, you will be loyal. They would contrast that with what we would call as transcendent nationalism, which means the nation, whatever it stands for, your nation is worthy of your sacrifice, no questions asked. And Lincoln would never say he was a nationalist in that sense. He would always say, I support America because I believe it's the nation of the world that is most committed to trying to lean into the Declaration that all men are created equal. But here's where it gets hard. Even though he says, I'm not committed to the nation in and of itself, I'm committed to these values, he convinces himself once the war begins that if the United States does not survive, there's no hope for the world. And then that distinction between the values of the country and the nation itself gets totally lost. And so I think he does sort of fall into a trap. Yes, sir.
Is there any evidence that Lincoln might have been inspired by the funeral oration of Pericles in ancient Athens?
Oh, I don't always get questions like that. It's a great question.
They're very similar.
No, it is. I'm trying to make a joke and being clumsy at it. It's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, that's not something I've looked into. I don't have the sense that Lincoln did much reading in what we consider classical or ancient history. He actually, historians would say, he's not very widely read. That he is a deep thinker, and what he does read, he plumbs to the depth. But you just look sort of the width of the books on his shelf, it's not very wide. Yes?
What's on the shelf? Shakespeare or the Bible?
In terms of the things that he reads most, Shakespeare probably first, and the Bible. The one history book that he says that he publicly says that he read was written by Parson Mason Weems, if anybody knows that name. Parson Weems is the one that invented the story of George Washington chopping down his father's cherry tree, and I cannot tell a lie, and something like that. So it wasn't probably deeply researched. Yes, ma'am?
Has the Gettysburg Address always been as popular as it is, or well received, or is this something that sort of has had a history of waning popularity or recognition?
So that's a great question, and that's a very historical question, because you're implicitly saying, I want to situate this in the flow of time, which is what historians do. It's a great question. So really fast. At the time, it's understood to be the address of a Republican president to a Republican audience. Now Lincoln he doesn't poke his fingers in the eyes of his opponents, doesn't do anything like that. But some of the things he says are things that only a Republican could say. The party that goes with him from Washington to Gettysburg is basically all Republican. There are like 11 or 12 state governors that attend. All but one are Republican. And also, presidents weren't supposed to campaign for office in the 19th century. A lot of people at the time thought this is one acceptable venue where Lincoln can sort of make, for all practical purposes, a campaign speech, and it's not considered inappropriate. So, all this to say, Democrats are still almost half of the northern population. Democrats either just ignore the speech or they ridicule it. It's not immediately famous. And it's actually not famous for a while. But probably by about the 1890s, it's beginning to be really elevated. By the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of, pretty broadly across the culture, we will say this is perhaps the classic expression of who we want to be. I tend to think it still serves that purpose even today, but with some fluctuations. And a classic example, a prime example would be Americans of color have at different times either very much praised it or often because of what they see as deficiencies in Lincoln's view on race, they'll be less enthusiastic. Great question. I think way in the back.
The way that I read this is that there's a lot of carnage on the battlefield, including Confederate boys. And the way I read it is that it's not their blood that's consecrating the spot. And now, is there anything in his future writings or speaking that gives them a way back, that they can come back to this noble project?
So that's a really good question. So one of the things that, if you didn't hear her question, she's saying there's some Confederate blood spilled on this battlefield also. Where does this sort of fit in? One of the things that Lincoln is going to say is, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he's telling his audience, we need to rededicate ourselves to this cause, in part because these men have given the last full measure of devotion for this. We need to take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. And one of the things I write in my manuscript is I'm pretty sure he didn't mean the Confederate did. I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have gone to the South and say, I want you in the South to be encouraged to rededicate yourself to your goals because you have men who are dying for that cause. He's clearly not meaning that. What Lincoln doesn't say anything necessarily explicitly on what you're talking about. But in his second inaugural, he will suggest, this is a teaser, he's going to suggest that if there is God's judgment here, it is judgment against the North as well as the South. Which means that we're not going to take a kind of moral period of moral self-righteousness or superiority. I think one of the reasons that the Gettysburg Address is so widely remembered today was that a lot of its most poetic phrases are also still vague. So in particular, by the early 20th century, when the United States is in the grips of racial segregation, but Americans will talk about government of the people, by the people, for the people, and can sort of just implicitly think, I just mean white Americans. It doesn't say that explicitly one way or the other, and so they can embrace that and impute whatever meaning they want to that. So I do think that sort of the ambiguity, some of the language, helps it to be unified in a way that it might not have been. Maybe one other question, real quickly. Carol, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, I was just going to ask, when you say that the Gettysburg Address wasn't well known and then the century became more notable, what were the forces or who were the people that brought the Gettysburg Address to prominence?
Oh, that's really good. I'm not sure that I can say, but just a couple of thoughts really. Maybe. I'll come back to the idea of this ambiguity. The other document that Lincoln is well known for, immediately after his death, is not his second inaugural. Second inaugural is pretty much ignored or even criticized. The other document is the Emancipation Proclamation. So the two documents that Lincoln are most remembered for, let's say, in that second generation, Emancipation Proclamation, Gettysburg Address. By the 1880s, the United States has moved away generally from an active Reconstruction policy in the South. The Supreme Court has begun to rule on some of the post-Civil War constitutional amendments, pretty much eviscerating them and allowing for disfranchisement and segregation, legally imposed segregation. There's a very famous statue to Lincoln in Washington, D.C., which was paid for by Black Americans and put up in 1877. It's called the Freedmen's Monument. It's not on the mall, so we tend not to visit it. But it shows Lincoln. He has this kneeling slave crouching in front of him with the chains broken off, and Lincoln is holding a document. And I'm confident in 1877 that was meant to be the Emancipation Proclamation. By the 1890s, no one wants to associate Lincoln primarily with the Emancipation Proclamation. The Gettysburg Address is almost by default the best alternative, and it is much less explicitly racial in its message, and I think that's a lot of why it's attractive. My time is up.
Thank you very much.
Very well.
Hope you all return next week to hear about the second inaugural. Thank you for coming.